Before we hear from our 7 speakers, here's a preview of the books and their matching principles. First principle, The Inherent Worth and Dignity of Every Person, The Hiding Place by Corrie ten Boom, presented by Marcia Hanna. Second principle, Justice, Equity, and Compassion in Human Relations, A Gentleman in Moscow by Amor Towles, presented by Judy Pereira. Third principle, Acceptance of one another and encouragement to spiritual growth in our congregations, Me Before You by Jojo Moyes, presented by Diane Dreby. The fourth principle, A Free and Responsible Search for Truth and Meaning, that's Imperfect Harmony by Stacy Horn. I will be presenting it. I'm sorry, I don't have the last, oh yes I do. Okay, the fifth principle, the right of conscience and the use of the democratic process within our congregations and in society at large. The Immortal Irishman by Timothy Egan, presented by Jerry McCluskey. The sixth principle, the goal of world community with peace, liberty, and justice for all. That's Mrs. Mike by Benedict Friedman, presented by Deb Dagavarian. And the seventh principle, respect for the interdependent web of all existence of which we are a part. Charlotte's Web by E.B. White, presented by Jesse Connor.
Morning. Our first principle is the inherent worth and dignity of every person, which I assume we all wholeheartedly embrace. But how many of us would be willing to literally risk our lives to live out that principle? There have been many books written about people who have done just that. Books, both fiction and nonfiction, about people who worked to protect and save Jewish people during the Nazi occupation. This book, a nonfiction book entitled The Hiding Place by Corrie ten Boom, is filled with examples of how the ten Boom family practiced our first principle. When I agreed to talk about a book that exemplified the first principle, I had a different book about World War II in mind. But when I read this book, I knew I had to highlight it instead. The author's name drew my attention because I have been to the ten Boom house in Haarlem, Holland, and I was deeply inspired by their story. The ten Boom family was an extremely religious Christian family. And even before World War II, they were well respected in the town of Haarlem due to their charity work for the sick, the poor, and anyone who needed any help. When the Germans invaded Holland, Corrie ten Boom was drawn into the resistance and began to house displaced Jewish people in the home she shared with her father Casper and her sister Betsy. Her brother, a minister, and her other sister also hid Jews in their homes. The entire family, including some of Corrie's nephews, were arrested and jailed by the Nazis for harboring Jews, even though the 6 Jewish people hiding in their home at the time were never found. They did all get out safely after the family was arrested. Corrie, her father, brother Wilhelm, nephew Peter, and sisters Betsy and Nani were sent to Schwenningen prison. Casper was in his 80s at the time and was given the opportunity to go free if he would agree not to cause any more trouble. But Casper clearly stated that, "Tomorrow I will open my door again to any man who knocks." He died in prison 2 weeks later. Peter, Wilhelm, and Nani were released soon after. But Corrie and Betsy were evacuated first to concentration camp in Holland called Vought, and then to the German concentration camp Ravensbrück. Conditions at Ravensbrück were extremely harsh, and Betsy, who suffered from pernicious anemia, died there. Before she died, she and Corrie prayed for the other prisoners, but they also prayed for the guards and for the other German officers. Corrie was eventually released and returned to her home in Haarlem, where she founded a home for people who suffered at the hands of the Nazis. In addition to that, she housed several Dutch people who had worked for the Nazis and who had lost their jobs and family and homes. She felt strongly that they deserved to be cared for too. She even went to work in Germany with former Nazis. At one point, after giving a talk about forgiveness at a church in Munich, she came face to face with one of the former SS guards from Ravensbrück. She describes her internal struggle to forgive this man as he stood in front of her with an outstretched hand. He didn't recognize her. She eventually shook his hand and found that she felt the forgiveness flowing through her arm. She strongly believed that every person deserved to be treated with dignity. She spent the rest of her life traveling around the world, giving messages of hope and love. And even though this book is full of Christian references, it is well worth reading for its message of ultimate forgiveness.
Representing our second principle, justice, equity, and compassion in human relations, is a rich work of historical fiction, A Gentleman in Moscow, by American writer Amor Towles, which has been called an elegant, wise testimony to the beauty and necessity of human connection. Spanning 4 decades after the Russian Revolution, the novel opens in 1922 when Count Alexander Ilyich Rostov is pronounced an unrepentant aristocrat by a Bolshevik tribunal and sentenced to house arrest in the Hotel Metropole, across the street from the Kremlin, for the rest of his life, subject to being shot on sight. Evicted from the luxurious rooms in the Metropole that he occupied before the sentencing, the now former person must inhabit a tiny attic room with only a few choice belongings. Still, blessedly, he's pretty much then left alone to his own devices. The Count is sanguine about his new digs, which, he quips, provide the satisfactions of traveling by train. So you get the picture. Count Rostov, urbane and erudite, accustomed to a life of ease, never having worked a day in his life, now confined to the hotel, while some of the most turbulent decades in Russian history are unfolding outside its doors. Yet the dire circumstances allow a surprisingly wide array of encounters. Indeed, the Count's very existence can be said to revolve around justice, equity, and compassion in human relations, or sometimes the unfortunate lack thereof. During the first few years of confinement, he survives on his wit and outgoing personality, more or less reproducing his former life in a smaller venue. After 4 years, though, being separated from the world leads him to contemplate suicide. He rebounds and reinvents himself, becoming the head waiter in the hotel's exclusive restaurant, building significant relationships from basement to attic. Over 30-plus years, Rostov's life is intertwined with all he comes in contact with: hotel staff, guests, friends, and others. Years later, a dear friend even trusts him with care of her young child, whom he ultimately raises to adulthood. But that's a story unto itself. A Gentleman in Moscow is mostly light and uplifting, in one beautifully rendered scene after another. The Metropole, as Towles creates it, is transfixing, full of colorful characters, some transitory, others permanent, mostly fictional, but some historical. Critics have wondered if there might be something unseemly about its degree of lightness, given that it takes place against the background of World War and the horrors of Stalinism. Towles handles this in various ways, including wry understatement, such as, let us concede that the early 30s in Russia were unkind. Thus he pursues his warm-hearted story while acknowledging the ocean of suffering taking place all around it. A Gentleman in Moscow is a wonderful book, which I love, as I think you can probably tell, made even more so by the author's exquisite prose, as infallibly erudite and self-effacing as Rostov himself, according to one critic. The book has also been called a masterly encapsulation of modern Russian history. Finally, in bringing us back to our second principle, this is a book in which the cruelties of the times can't begin to erase the glories of real human connection. Thank you.
Gloria in excelsis Deo, et in terra pax omnibus bone voluntatis. Laudamus te, benedicimus te, adoramus te, glorificamus te. Qui tollis peccata mundi, suscipe deprecationem nostram. Tu solus altissimus, Iesu Christe, cum Sancto Spiritu, in gloria Dei Patris. Amen. Why do these words from the Latin Mass give me such joy? I was never Catholic, unlike a great many of you. And, and I often find myself on the other side of the Catholic Church in my worldview. The Catholic Church actually legislated against women and men singing in mixed choruses in 1906. And in fact, at least until recently, women don't sing in the Vatican. Well, my first experience with the Latin Mass was in a high school music class, and our music teacher, Mr. Jargisian, required that we students memorize the words of the Mass and its English translation. An understanding of the Latin Mass is foundational to all learning about Western music. There's nothing that has influenced my experience of music, specifically choral singing, more. I hear the words as a different kind of music, without melodic context, just the words. The words have inspired some of the most beautiful music ever created. I've sung these words so many times over the years, and I still can't explain clearly why they touch me so deeply. God is certainly not the answer for me, but singing about her clearly is. Imperfect Harmony Imperfect Harmony by Stacy Horn is the book I selected for our fourth principle. This book helped me find my way back to singing with a community choir after an absence of 15 years. It's part memoir, part history of choral singing, and part science of singing. Each chapter is based on a choral work performed at the community choir of Grace Church in Manhattan, where the author sings in the soprano section. To quote Horn, "For the past few decades, as boyfriends come and go, jobs come and go, cats live and die, a stay in rehab when I was 30, depression, broken engagements, and the death of those I love, there has always been this, the Choral Society of Grace Church. Life is hard. Battles of all kinds continue to rage around us, and disappointments accumulate. But singing, these are still Horn's words, singing is the one thing in my life that never fails to take me to where disenchantment is almost non-existent and feeling good is pretty much guaranteed." When Stacy auditioned for the choir, she warned the director that she does not have a great voice. She was accepted anyway. The ability to read music and to blend is far more important to choral singing than is having a great voice. In fact, research shows that group singing and performance can produce satisfying and therapeutic sensations even when the sound produced by the voice is of a mediocre quality. Of the many stories in the book which touch me deeply, the one that stayed with me the most is from the preface. In 1919, Wilkes-Barre, PA, 92 men died in one of the worst disasters in the anthracite mines of PA. The men were riding in a line of mine cars when a spark from one of their lamps ignited 24 kegs of blasting powder. There was a roar, read a newspaper account, and in an instant, every man and boy on the train was either dead or dying. Survivors were treated for burns and experienced amputations. A few days after the disaster, 13 of the surviving men, who all were either miners or sons or brothers of miners, gathered at the local school and formed the Orpheus Glee Club. Keep in mind, these miners were mostly Welsh, and choral singing, particularly men's choruses, was and still is part of the fabric of Welsh life. The Welsh sing at work, to celebrate, and to grieve. To these people, singing seemed the only possible response to a suffering beyond words. Most Wednesday or Friday nights, when I sing with the Masterworks Choir of Ocean City, I can expect at some unpredictable time during the rehearsals to experience a shimmering sensation of sound. On a more human level, I feel a communion with the other singers. The ancient and venerable bass that is the truth teller, the privilege of age, after a scolding by the director for not coming in on a cue. John, you didn't tell us where you were starting. And this guy can always just say whatever he wants and it somehow gets by. The tenor who has been glared at for singing too loudly, correcting that behavior exactly once before making an entrance like a hunting horn. The soprano, probably in her 80s, who always sits alone. My sisters in the alto section, dependable, solid, accurate, quick to respond to corrections. I will close with a quote from Friedrich Nietzsche that I serendipitously ran across this week in an unlikely place. I am light, now I fly. Now I see myself beneath myself. Now a God dances through me.
I'm doing the fifth principle, the right of conscience and the use of the democratic process within our congregations and in society at large. Okay. The hero of our story, Thomas More, was an American patriot and an Irish patriot. In this favorite book, The Immortal Irishman, Timothy Egan, the Irish-American author and New York Times op-ed writer, elegantly and passionately portrays the life of this revolutionary as a man with the gift of the gab and the so-called luck of the Irish. Thomas More is spirited and seems immortal from the opening pages, from the failed Irish uprising of 1848 to his exile to Tasmania as a British political prisoner. His breathtaking escape from his Tasmanian island prison allows for the full scope of his skills to be utilized, from his charming of the locals to surviving the brutal passage on the ocean waves in his journey via cargo ship to America. In America, he is celebrated as an Irish hero and as an enemy of the British crown, from whom he is an exile and an escaped political prisoner, but proves himself more of an American patriot when he heroically supports the fight of the free slaves in New York City against his countrymen. For his loyalty to the Union cause, and because he is a prominent and popular Irishman in New York, he's rewarded with an appointment as a general in Grant's Union Army. As general, he is challenged, not only by the cause for which he is fighting on the battlefields, but by the curse of his inner demons and the fight against the whiskey bottle. He celebrates and advocates for his Irish countrymen on the battlefields and leads his men, Irish, American, and former slaves, bravely in battle. For Thomas More's loyalty to the freedom and dutiful exercise of his conscience and the use of the democratic process in his political life in America and his former life as an Irish rebel fighting British cruelty to the starving Irish masses during the Great Hunger, I celebrate him as an exemplary patron of our fifth principle. As a revolutionary young islander, as a political prisoner in Tasmania, as a professional orator of the first magnitude in the mean environment of the New York of the Irish famine years, and as an appointed general in Grant's Union Army, he was always forcefully guided by the rights of those he led, and became one with those he, as an Irish aristocrat, could have disparaged as less than. He considered himself and acted upon his belief that he was one with and equal with his brothers in arms, and fought for the Union cause as his own, side by side with the hard-fighting and hard-drinking Irish immigrants who fought and died to make this new country their own. After the war, he was elevated to the position as a governor in the new Montana Territory, but not without dire consequences for his health and, yes, his life. The new rough and ready territory was very conservative politically and overrun with enemies and adversaries who did not approve of the outsider's appointment. Mayer met an untimely death at the age of 43, which is still a mystery, but which Egan attempts to resolve based on circumstantial evidence. Timothy Egan tells a masterful, spirited, an uplifting story of this Thomas Mehr, who had the skills to run a life caught up in all the drama of mid-19th century existence that was the United States and an occupied Ireland. His conscience ruled an Irish Revolution, soldiers in the Union Army, and the backwater region that was Montana Territory. Timothy Egan brings to life an historical figure previously unknown to me, but was brought to life with so much history and research and powerful writing and storytelling that Thomas Mehr became a living legend in the pages of this history book. He was also a living legend in 19th century America among the Irish famine refugees to the highest echelons of American life, including Abraham Lincoln and Ulysses S. Grant. Timothy Egan followed his conscience and mores to record the story of his belief in and exacting reliance upon democratic principles and process with the help of a good subject. In The Immortal Irishman, he portrayed how countries, both the United States and Ireland's, participation in the rights of conscience can result in a new, more democratic republic for former slaves who are given the birthrights of humanity, a process which can only happen when the minds and hearts of prophetic individuals such as Thomas Mehr take action.
Our sixth principle reads, "The goal of world community with peace, liberty, and justice for all." Although it sounds suspiciously like the Pledge of Allegiance, it carries a noble sentiment. The book I'll be speaking about embodies this principle. It's not a great book, but it's my absolute favorite book, which I first read as a young teen. The book, Mrs. Mike, was written by Benedict and Nancy Friedman, who got married despite Nancy having been told she had only 3 months to live. That was in 1947. Both Benedict and Nancy Friedman lived into their 90s. Mrs. Mike is based on the true story of Catherine Mary O'Fallon, a 16-year-old Bostonian with pleurisy at the turn of the century, who traveled west to live with her uncle in Calgary, Alberta. She soon met and married Sergeant Mike Flanagan of the Northwest Mounted Police. Sergeant Mike was stationed in the wilderness of Western Canada, at times along the Peace River or Lesser Slave Lake. He and Kathy lived among the Cree, learning their language and cooking, washing, building, trapping, and hunting with them. Both Mike and Kathy resolutely defended their Cree neighbors against rogue itinerants. Kathy's indomitable spirit matched her husband's. They braved snowstorms in which people would disappear, flooding from the Chinook, rampant forest fires, deadly grizzly bear attacks, and a diphtheria epidemic that killed both of their children. It was truly a hard life, but their love and courage were strong. Mrs. Mike inspired me to live boldly, to take certain risks. It also inspired me to visit some of the places Sergeant Mike and Kathy had been. So a few days after I turned 23, with a freshly minted master's degree in sociology, I took off 2 months to travel by train west to east through Canada, starting in Vancouver. My next stop was Banff, Alberta, where the snow was deep, the air frigid, and I trudged through streets named moose, muskrat, caribou, otter, and grizzly. I spent a couple of weeks among those majestic, mesmerizing, snow-covered mountains, as well as the icy streets of Calgary, 66 years after Mrs. Mike had been there. Eventually, I continued my journey eastward, back to my home to look for my first professional job. Sergeant Mike's mission was to protect and serve the people in his part of the wilderness. He and Kathy genuinely championed our sixth principle, world community with peace, liberty, and justice for all.
Good. Good morning. This morning, I'm pleased to have the opportunity to talk about our seventh principle, respect for the interdependent web of existence of which we are all a part, which is at the heart of Charlotte's Web by E.B. White, a book that is near and dear to everyone who has ever read it. The fact that this tender story of friendship and love has the power to comfort and give reassurance was brought home to me a few weeks ago when my 4.5-year-old grandson injured himself. Major distraction to ease the pain was in order. First ice cream, and next the Lego Batman movie. They didn't work. What he asked for instead was that I read Charlotte's Web to him. He was soon consoled. So let's look at how Charlotte's Web reflects our seventh principle. White's choice of 3 widely despised animals, a pig, a spider, and a rat, as the key non-human characters, are ordinarily shunned or feared. Pigs because they smell bad, spiders because they're hairy and scary, and rats because, well, they're rats. Charlotte's Web undercuts those ordinary attitudes. We are all drawn into what it means to be a pig destined for slaughter, or a spider in danger of being squashed at any moment, or a rat hated by everyone. We're encouraged to move beyond our own initial reactions and to consider the uniqueness and the magic of spiders and the important role that they play in the ecosystem. We see, too, the value of rats as scavengers. And finally, thinking of Wilbur's possible fate, we might come to question our own eating practices. The notion of respecting the web of existence is underscored when the farmer, Mr. Arabelle, begins to wonder if his daughter Fern might be onto something with her sympathy for the farm's animals. Maybe animals do talk, he says. Maybe our ears aren't as sharp as Fern's. This theme appears again when Mrs. Arabelle grows so worried about her daughter spending hours in the barn with the animals that she goes to Dr. Dorian for advice. "Do you understand how there could be writing in spider's web?" she asks him at one point. "I don't understand it," the doctor replies. "But for that matter, I don't understand how a spider learned to spin a web in the first place." When the words appeared, everyone said it was a miracle. But nobody pointed out that the web itself is a miracle. A young spider knows how to spin a web without instructions from anybody. Don't you consider that a miracle? In the past few weeks, I reread Charlotte's Web for the 6th, 8th, 10th, time, and I discovered that the 66-year-old classic conveys wisely and gently not just our seventh principle, but nearly all of our UU principles. Going through them each would require an entire service by itself. I think what makes Charlotte's Web cherished by today's 4.5-year-olds and by the millions and millions of people who have read it is that it is infused with friendship, acceptance, compassion, and love.
When I first mentioned the idea of doing this service to the book club, I have to say they looked sort of a mixture between terrified and horrified. But I want to thank them so much for going along with this idea for a service. And I just want to make one final quote. This is from author Jane Smiley. Many people, myself among them, feel better at the mere sight of a book. How many? Yeah. All right. Please rise now in body